baseless, because the current rules they are in are there because they are racing animals and in the racing environment and subject to the sorts of contexts that racing puts them in. That we have to essentially, racing puts them at a high risk. The fact that people make money out of racing and might be tempted to cut corners puts them at high risk. We have to put strict rules around racing and the way dogs are treated in racing. That won't be necessary when dogs are no longer racing. So they will have the same protections as every other dog in the community once the phase-out period came about. There won't be a welfare void there. We had questions, people had questions and some confusion about the dogs going interstate or being able to breed dogs here to send interstate, or what if we had people in Tasmania who co-owned dogs interstate. Now, if you engage with the evidence in the inquiry, you'll see that those questions are answered, and there is clarity there under this bill. And I think over time, people will see that there's clarity there. I know that there's quite a bit of panic about it at the moment. One of the things we do have up our sleeve, Mr. President, is that this is just the beginning of a lengthy transition period. And it's interesting to consider New Zealand, because I was just reading news reports from New Zealand about the recent vote that they had there on greyhound racing. And it's funny because some of the news reports reference the fact that in New Zealand there's some consternation because they're only giving people, from the time they announced it there to the time it's going to finish, they only had 20 months actually for the transition. And in some of these news reports it references the fact that Tasmania's announcement gives the industry 47 months, and that's a positive compared to what they're facing in New Zealand. So they've compared us favourably in terms of a time frame for transition. I find it interesting too that I hadn't properly clocked the matters relating to compensation in New Zealand. I know that the dollar figures from New Zealand have been put forward as comparing unfavourably with what's been put forward so far from the government on compensation. But in fact, when you actually look into it, in New Zealand, they're not providing compensation at all. The dollar figures that they're talking about are what will be spent to transition. The news reports I was reading, there's people up in arms about the fact that the 1,055 people who have jobs in that industry in that country won't be getting compensation at all from the government in New Zealand. They'll get transition assistance to transition their dogs out and to potentially transition themselves out, but they won't get compensation per se from what's been announced in New Zealand. So there's a lot of consternation there. We have the great benefit of having a very generous period of time, if we get on with it, to undertake a transition period, and that's what came out through this inquiry into the bill, because this bill has to be the starting point for that. If this isn't the starting point, we could end up being in a situation a bit like the consternation that's being experienced in New Zealand, where people feel that things are falling apart a bit around the edges because of a shorter time frame and because their legislation has come late in the piece in that sense. Certainly the Racing Commissioner has been very clear in his evidence to the inquiry in the importance of this legislation passing to begin an orderly process and to look after welfare. And if people look to the Hansard, some of which is in the report, but also if you just look to the Hansard more broadly from the Commissioner to the inquiry process, you'll see he makes comments, and I'll just quote a couple of things from him. This is from our hearing on the 11th of February for the inquiry, and the Commissioner appearing, Mr Sean Carroll. Some of the things he says, from that perspective, incremental reform is no longer adequate. We cannot rely solely on voluntary compliance or internal regulation to address systemic risk. We cannot continue to expand an industry without the capacity to protect animal welfare. And we cannot ignore the widening gap between community expectations and industry practice. For these reasons, the phase-out legislation is necessary. However, legislation alone is not sufficient. A strong, detailed and enforceable transition plan is essential. The bill proposes that I'd be responsible for developing that plan consistent with my statutory mandate to uphold integrity, enforceable standards and ensure fairness. And then a bit later in his evidence, Mr President, he says, He says, since the announcement of the government's decision, uncertainty with the industry has intensified. In some cases, heightened emotion has contributed to conduct that has fallen outside the accepted standards and at times breached the rules of racing and the law. And a little bit further on, he says, from the perspective of integrity, enforceability and risk management, the conclusion is clear. The legislation is not only desirable, it's necessary. So the Commissioner was really clear with us in his evidence about the necessity of this legislation to get things on track for an appropriate and a careful and a safe transition. One of the things that I was particularly interested in looking at was this matter of the closure plan that's in the legislation and how we could introduce into the legislation greater certainty and confidence around the closure plan, more detail into the legislation, detail that in a non-exhaustive way outlined some expected areas to be covered in that closure plan. Setting up an expectation in legislation that it would be tabled in Parliament, setting up an expectation in the legislation that the closure plan would involve consultation. So putting those things in there, Mr President, not because they necessarily changed the process of how that closure plan might be developed, because the Commissioner was very clear he was going to undertake a very comprehensive and consultative process for it, but it puts it into the legislation, and I think the government's responded with some suggested amendments to give effect to some of that inclusion of greater detail and certainty and confidence on that part of the legislation. I was pleased that there was a receptivity to do that. I think we also need to understand that the closure plan may be an evolving document, so there were discussions during the inquiry about could it be adjusted or amended or reviewed at different stages as it played out because of changing circumstances or needs arising, and it was clarified that yes, it could be, and that would be outlined in the closure plan itself, that could and how that would happen. The Commissioner, in his evidence to us, laid out a very comprehensive list of matters that were already part of the discussion about inclusion in the closure plan. So I think that was a recommended improvement to the bill just in terms of delivering that confidence and certainty. So I was pleased to see it. There were lots of questions during the inquiry around the breeding arrangements, and I think most of those questions are actually answered in the evidence if people go to look at it. And I think there's elements that of course people will object to because they don't want the outcome that this is working towards, Mr President, and as I said, I understand that. So of course there's still going to be things that people find problematic or hiccups. The other area that people were, it's funny, we had some circular, I guess, circular sort of discussions or consideration of whether compensation should or shouldn't be in legislation, and I think there absolutely should be reference to compensation in the legislation, and that's one of the things I was interested to see put in as an expected aspect of a closure plan, so that the expectation is set up in the legislation and that's confidently can be pointed to. But what was really clear, particularly talking to the Commissioner about a plan for compensation, is that is definitely not something we should be rushing headlong into quantifying exhaustively in legislation at this point in time what the specific arrangements of that will be, because we need to carefully figure that out. It's a complex, varied industry. There are different sort of tiers or levels of participants in terms of the degree to which they're financially reliant on or involved in the industry. So compensation plans and how we work our way towards a model for that, it's definitely not a legislative matter. It should be guaranteed through legislation and referred to in legislation, in my view, but not put in detail. Yeah. So that's been clarified in various times in evidence given to the committee and the discussions had. And I think for anybody to demand that we should have outlined, or that the bill should have some form of specific detailed outline of a compensation model is probably a little bit reckless, actually, Mr President, particularly at this stage of things. So I think if we were to rush to do that now in order to legislate it in some way, we would be doing the industry participants a serious disservice. because I think it's unlikely we could design something in that way that would fit into a legislative model of things that would be sufficiently nuanced and comprehensive and mindful of circumstances in the industry.
And flexible.
So, Mr. President, those were the sorts of things that I just wanted to pick out as some of the areas that are contemplated in the inquiry report, noting that the member for Hobart has more comprehensively gone through the very full list of findings and recommendations. I do think that we're in an interesting situation here. As I said, this is a noting debate on the bill and the inquiry on the bill, I should say, and the report that we've presented as a result of that inquiry. I understand that there will continue to be potential criticisms and issues that people might have around process about this whole thing. We're sort of set on that path in some sense by, at the very outset, the way the government's gone about it. My view is we take a practical approach at ensuring our best efforts, that at each stage we undertake the job that's needed to properly consider what's before us in this place and the matters presented to us. I think that's what's been done in the committee process and report, and I do stand by that. And I know that we will have further discussion on the bill and in its detail, potentially at a different stage here, so I won't go further into that. And I'm also not going to go further into discussion about the overarching policy at this stage either, having alluded to it fairly lightly in my contribution, I think, today. So, Mr. President, I note the report from the committee, and I hope that members are able to engage with it genuinely, and the evidence sits around it. There's a lot of really important, valuable information in the evidence of the inquiry. And we all know that not all evidence makes it into a report of every inquiry. You have to go through a process of winnowing it down for presentation. But for those who are particularly interested in specific matters to do with the bill, there's quite a valuable trove of evidence there as part of the records of the inquiry. So I definitely point people towards it. And again, Mr. President, absolutely put on the record here that I appreciate the involvement of everybody who took part in the inquiry. I've tried to make sure that I've listened carefully at every stage of the process and genuinely took on board things that were raised and sought to ensure that we could consider and address them in some sense as part of the process. I note the report.